Scientists pulled a human genome from gum, 10,000-year-old gum, birch tar, chewed once, spit out, buried in Danish mud since the Stone Age, skin color, eye color, last meal, mouth bacteria, all from a wad smaller than your thumbnail. They named her Lola. Dark skin, dark hair, blue eyes. She'd eaten hazelnuts and duck. She chewed birch pitch on a Danish island. Then she dropped it in the dirt. Nobody touched it for 5,700 years. That's the headline. The real story is weirder. That gum rewrote what we knew about Northern Europe. Let's start with what she was actually chewing, because it wasn't gum. Not the way you'd recognize it. Birch pitch is a tar. You make it by heating birch bark in a sealed, low-oxygen environment until it melts into a thick, black, sticky thermoplastic. Stone Age people used it to glue flint blades onto wooden handles, seal containers against water, and patch cracks in boats. It was one of the earliest synthetic materials humans ever manufactured, and producing it required holding a precise temperature for several hours in an era when precise temperature meant staring at a fire and hoping for the best. Picture holding a lump of hot, dark, pine-scented resin between your molars, working it until it cools into a pliable wad. So why would anyone put it in their mouth? Good question, because nobody's sure. 3 theories. First, chewing softened the pitch so it could be shaped into a better adhesive before applying it. Second, birch pitch has mild antiseptic properties, so chewing it might have soothed a toothache or cleaned a wound. Stone Age ibuprofen. Third, and the researchers at Copenhagen were careful to include this, people might have chewed it the same reason you chew gum right now. Boredom. Habit. Something to do with your jaw while your hands were busy. All 3 could be true at once. That's the frustrating beauty of archaeology. A behavior doesn't need one reason. But whichever theory you pick, every one of them involves pressing tree tar against the inside of your cheek and working it with your molars, which means every one of them involves leaving behind saliva, skin cells, and whatever you ate for lunch. That changed once a team in Copenhagen realized what was trapped inside. How does spit survive in mud for 10 millennia? Here's the trick. Birch pitch is hydrophobic. It repels water. When Lola's chewed wad landed in the waterlogged, oxygen-starved sediment of a Baltic coastline, the pitch sealed her saliva, her cheek cells, fragments of her last meal, and the entire bacterial ecosystem living in her mouth into a tiny anaerobic capsule. No oxygen, no bacteria that break things down, no decomposition, just preservation for 5,700 years. When a team at the University of Copenhagen finally extracted DNA from the sample in 2019, they didn't get fragments. They got a complete human genome. From gum. That is not supposed to happen. Most ancient DNA comes from teeth, or from the petrous bone, a dense structure deep inside the inner ear, and even those rarely yield full sequences from samples this old. Lola's discarded chewing gum preserved her genetic material more completely than her own skeleton could have. Her trash outlasted her bones, and bones are what we usually build entire civilizations' histories on. A lump of chewed tar from someone who didn't matter to anyone just casually outperformed all of them, which tells you something about what we've been looking for and what we've been missing. So what did the genome actually say? Something the textbooks didn't expect. By 3700 BCE, farming had already arrived in Scandinavia. The Neolithic agricultural revolution had been sweeping across Europe for 2,000 years, carried by migrants from Anatolia, modern Turkey, who brought wheat, barley, cattle, and an entirely new way of living. By the time Lola was alive, most of Denmark's population should have been genetically descended from those farming migrants. Lola wasn't. Not even close. Her DNA matched Western European hunter-gatherers, the people who had been living in Europe for thousands of years before a single grain of wheat crossed the Bosporus. She carried none of the Anatolian farmer markers that dominated the region's gene pool. Genetically, she was the old population, the people who were there first. But here's the thing that made the researchers stop and reconsider. She wasn't living in some isolated wilderness. She was on an island right next to established farming communities. Her people hadn't been pushed out. They hadn't been absorbed. They were still there, still eating wild food, apparently coexisting with farmers without fully mixing into their gene pool. The clean narrative, farmers arrive, hunters vanish, doesn't hold. The problem was that we'd been telling a replacement story when the evidence pointed to a coexistence story, and the real transition was slower, messier, and far more complicated than the textbooks allowed. What does Lola's body tell us about that transition? Quite a lot, once you know where to look. She was lactose intolerant. Her genome lacked the mutation for adult lactose persistence, the ability to digest milk past childhood, which makes perfect sense for a hunter-gatherer lineage. That mutation spread with cattle herding, took centuries to become common even among farming populations, and in 3700 BCE, it was still vanishingly rare. In 3700 BCE, most of Europe still couldn't drink milk without consequences. And that wasn't the only thing her genome revealed about the gap between her world and the one forming around her. She also carried the genetic variants for dark skin and blue eyes. That combination sounds unusual today, but it was standard across Mesolithic Europe. The lighter skin variants that dominate modern Northern European populations arrived with those same Anatolian farmers and didn't become universal for generations. So Lola is a snapshot of a world caught between two eras, a hunter-gatherer in a farming age, dark-skinned in a region that would become famously pale, lactose intolerant on an island that would eventually sit inside one of the world's most prolific dairy economies. She's not a relic. She's proof that the future hadn't arrived yet. Not for everyone, not all at once. Imagine someone in 2026 living exactly the way people lived in 1826. Same food, same tools, same social structure, while their neighbors have smartphones. That's Lola. Except the gap isn't 200 years, it's 2,000. Now here's where it gets genuinely weird. The genome was only half the story, because Lola's gum didn't just preserve her DNA, it preserved everything that was living inside her. Ancient DNA researchers don't just sequence the host, they sequence everything: human, animal, plant, microbial. Lola's gum contained DNA from hazelnuts and mallard duck, confirming a diet pulled entirely from the wild. No wheat, no barley, no trace of any domesticated crop or animal product. She was eating Stone Age food in the age of farms, and doing it apparently by choice. The farming communities with their domesticated crops were right there, right next door, and she wasn't interested. The bacterial profile went even deeper than the diet. Her oral microbiome included Streptococcus pneumonia, a pathogen that still causes pneumonia today, and traces of Epstein-Barr virus, which still infects roughly 95% of humans worldwide. She had active gum disease, and here's the part that connects her world to yours. The bacterial strains were, in many cases, genetically close to modern variants, which means these organisms have been riding along in human mouths for at least 10,000 years, co-evolving with us generation by generation with remarkably little drift. What does that mean for you? Your mouth right now contains direct descendants of the same microbial lineages that colonized a Stone Age woman's gums on a Baltic island before the invention of writing, agriculture, or the wheel. You have more in common with Lola than you'd probably prefer. 10,000 years of civilization, antibiotics, mouthwash, and fluoride toothpaste, and your oral microbiome is still running essentially the same software. Which raises a question that the researchers themselves flagged. What makes a chewed wad of birch pitch more valuable than a burial mound? Bones tell you someone existed. Teeth tell you what they ate over years. Grave goods tell you what their community valued enough to bury. But a piece of chewed gum captures a single afternoon, one person, one meal, one snapshot of the microscopic ecosystem living inside them at that exact moment. Lola wasn't important. She wasn't a chief, a shaman, a warrior, or anyone a chronicle would have recorded. She chewed some tree tar, spit it out, and kept walking. The entire event lasted maybe 10 minutes. No ceremony, no intention, no awareness that she was producing the single most detailed biological record of her era. Just a human being doing something completely unremarkable in a world that wouldn't develop writing for another 3,000 years. And that unremarkable moment contains more recoverable biological data than most royal tombs, more than mummies wrapped in linen, more than warriors buried with gold. Because Lola didn't try to be remembered. And that, paradoxically, is why the record is so clean. The Pharaohs spent fortunes preserving themselves for eternity. Lola spit on the ground. Guess which one gave us a complete genome? Think about that the next time you spit out a piece of gum. You're leaving behind your full genome, your ancestry, your diet, your oral health profile, every virus currently replicating in your bloodstream, and a bacterial census of your entire mouth, all in something you won't think about 3 seconds from now. Lola didn't think about hers either. She had no idea that the most complete portrait of her life wouldn't come from anything she built, anything she valued, or anything she meant to leave behind. It came from something she threw away. 5,700 years in the mud, and then someone picked it up.